The 2025 Formula One season is fast approaching, and it's looking like it might be an incredibly interesting season. We have so much to look forward to between driver changes, a bunch of rookies coming in, and an incredibly close field after the end of 2024. There is much to look forward to, and I think it's going to be a really promising season. After 4 teams were able to bring home a victory last year, it's looking like we might be able to have a proper championship fight in 2025. But is it going to be as good as everybody hopes? I think there are going to be some challenges throughout the year that might cause 2025 to not be the year that everybody hopes. But let's get into that and a bit more of the biggest storylines of 2025. Hello everybody, my name is Michael and welcome back to Last to First. After a pretty long hiatus, I am back after the holidays and just a lot going on in my personal life. I took a little bit of time off and now I am back to kick off 2025 and have a really excellent year as we go into a 2025 Formula One season that might be one of the best in recent times. There's a lot of things to look forward to, and I think we can be optimistic that it is going to be a really promising and interesting season. But will there be some factors that make it not so interesting? I think there might be some challenges to the 2025 season. On top of that, there are plenty of other interesting things to look out for in 2025. So let's get into that and some of the biggest talking points and storylines that I find interesting and I'm looking forward to in 2025. So let's get into the biggest topic of the video, and is 2025 going to be as good as everybody hopes? I think it is really shaping up to be an excellent season. After we had 4 different teams having wins in 2024 and having an incredibly tight field by the end of the season, with it seemingly only getting closer, then I think it's going to be even closer this year. It's really not typical in Formula One to have reasonable expectations that 4 teams can fight for wins and maybe even a championship, and I think we do have that going into this year. 2025 really has it all. It has a close field, interesting driver changes, lots of rookies and some kind of half rookies and some that are already looking like they might be losing their seats sooner rather than later. Jack Doohan. And it's also the end of a rule cycle with a new rule cycle on the horizon, which is going to have some serious impacts on the season. I think there really is reason for optimism, and I think it will be a good season. But I do have a concern for the year, and that is the looming 2026 regulations. The teams are all going to be balancing starting serious work on 2026 with developing in 2025 to maybe fight for a championship. You know, there will be some teams who maybe are at the back of the grid who might switch off early and they'll be able to get a head start on 2025 because they don't have too much to fight for. But then again, with the championship being as close as it is, I think every team's going to be able to score some points this year and fight for reasonable positions. So every position in the Constructors' Championship does matter for the prize pool. So there might not be too many teams at the way back that can sign off super early. On the contrary, if some of the bigger teams like McLaren and Red Bull are really actively fighting for the championship, they might want to push on with 2025 for slightly longer just to try to seal a championship while they can. Giving up an active championship fight to work on a theoretical next year is a really tough call to make. And I think you got to fight for the championship while you can, but it might end up hurting them in 2026. So that balance is going to be very tricky for all of the teams to deal with throughout the year. You know, typically we have a pretty dominant team coming into the year, and when there is a dominant team, they are able to switch off earlier and get started ahead of time on the next regulation or the next year. But at the end of 2024, we really didn't have one dominant team. So really none of them are guaranteed to be able to switch off early and start on the 2026 regulations. The beginning of the championship is really going to be key because if one of the front-running teams like Mercedes doesn't start off particularly well, then they might just bin off 2025 for 2026, and then that's already one championship contender down, and then we're realistically down to 3 at that point. So it very easily could start dwindling down with who could fight for the championship. Or another potential scenario is that a team may go down a bad development route. Either either at the beginning of the year or mid-season and just determine it's not worth the resources to figure out the problem for 2025. And then there you go. You have another team down and we're just left with two. Now I'll take even a two-way championship, but if we're having all this expectation for a four-way battle, we can see how quickly that it can be diminished. If all of the four big teams can be there or thereabouts, like at the end of 2024, and they'll be there at the start of 2025, then I think we can have a little hope of a really interesting championship fight, especially if the team's performances fluctuate as much as they were last year. It'll make for an interesting year. With the field being so close, another really tantalizing potential of the year is a proper driver championship fight. Realistically, there's 6 drivers who for sure could fight for the title if the car is competitive in the top 4 teams. So that alone is a massive amount of drivers who could potentially be fighting for wins in the championship. There are question marks over Lawson for sure, and also Antonelli, even though he seems like he will be a very good driver. He is very young and inexperienced, so I think it would be tough for him to properly fight for a championship. But hey, I would take a 6-way driver championship fight any day of the week, that's for sure. I don't know that that'll quite happen, but we can all hope and dream if the top 4 teams are competitive together. What could make a driver championship so interesting is that if there is a multi-team fight, the strength of the driver pairings in the top 4 teams are very, very high level. You know, maybe some question marks over Lawson, but other than that, there are some really incredible drivers in those teams. So that'll make it for quite the spicy battle. You know, I think a possible scenario is that maybe teams like McLaren and Ferrari, or insert Red Bull or Mercedes, could be slightly ahead of the other teams, but with those drivers and those teams, they'll be taking points off each other. The teammates will be taking points off each other as well as the other team, and then it allows for somebody like a Verstappen to just slip in, who will just slowly and steadily be able to score points week in and week out and not really have somebody taking points off of them. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, if a couple teams are going to be taking points off of each other while another driver is able to kind of sneak in there and take advantage of that. Now, it's way too early for any predictions, given that it's not even preseason testing yet, but I'm definitely going to make a predictions video because it will be very fun just to have some banter about who I think is going to win the championship for the year. So stay tuned for that. I think that'll be some good fun. And at the end of the year, we can see how completely wrong I was. Now, another concern I have for 2025 is the dirty air problem. This has always been a problem in Formula One since I've been watching. It's gotten worse. It's gotten better. Generally, it's just gotten worse. It got a bit better in 2022, but things are getting a bit worse. Despite, the set of rules decreasing the dirty air and it definitely improving after 2021, the teams have developed the cars continuously, and that have led to the dirty air problem getting worse and worse and causing the racing to be worse. Each year of these current regulations, there have been progressively fewer and fewer overtakes across the year, which is always a sign that it's getting a bit more challenging for overtaking. And we've seen a bit more mistakes when drivers are kind of battling it out in braking zones because of the loss of downforce, like Piastri in Abu Dhabi. In 2024, drivers were complaining more and more about the dirty air, and that could certainly cause more problems in 2025 with having close and interesting races. If drivers aren't able to overtake, then it could be a battle for pole more than anything. Will we see a season where the pole sitter wins the majority of the races? Will it really not be a lot of proper fights for the win? I think it's certainly possible, but I think even if that is the case, as long as we don't know who is going to win, who is going to get pole, and there's different people getting pole each weekend, then I think that'll still be a very interesting season. Of course, we want really unpredictable races with a true battle for the lead, but that's a lot to ask out of F1, that's for sure. So overall, I have a lot of high hopes for 2025. I don't see why it won't be a pretty interesting and good season, but will it be an all-time great? Will there be a 4-way battle for the championship? That I'm a little unsure about. I think there are reasons to believe that that won't be the case, but overall, I'm optimistic and ready to properly kick things off. The second biggest talking point and thing that I am most interested to see in 2025, and I think a lot of people are, is Lewis Hamilton's move to Ferrari. I mean, who is not interested in this? Even if you are not a fan of Ferrari or Hamilton, this is a big driver move and not something that you see every year. So it is going to be incredibly interesting, and it's going to be a proper challenge for Lewis Hamilton. I mean, we saw in 2024 Charles Leclerc seeming to be peaking after a really incredible year, and I think he is going to be ready to fight for a title. And then on the contrary, we have Hamilton coming in there, who's coming off of his worst ever season in F1. It was not a good season for him, and I was not impressed. For me, he was the most disappointing driver of the year, and there's definitely a lot of question marks over him going into the year with the season that he had, and how is he going to cope against Leclerc, who had one of his best seasons ever last year. It's going to be incredibly interesting. Really, the biggest question is if the recent Hamilton struggles are a Mercedes problem or if they are a Hamilton problem. We're going to find pretty quickly the answers to that question at the beginning of his Ferrari stint. It will take a bit of time for Hamilton to get used to Ferrari and everything, the team workings, the car, everything like that. But pretty early on, I think we will have some answers to those questions. If it does end up being a Mercedes problem, then I think we are certainly in for a very interesting teammate battle between Hamilton and Leclerc, and one that I am extremely excited about. One thing going for Hamilton is that he seems to have a driving style that is closer to Leclerc, so hopefully for him, the car will be a bit more suited to his style, so that'll help him to get into the window more frequently, because he certainly did still have peaks in 2024. He just was extremely inconsistent, and his lows were very, very low. It's going to take some time for Hamilton to adapt to the new team, a new race engineer, new way of going about an entire weekend, just a completely new team. I mean, his entire Formula One career, he's been a part of Mercedes in one form or another. He had Mercedes engines in his time in McLaren, and he was working with McLaren and or Mercedes for his entire time. So it's going to be a completely new team and environment for him. The only part that is going to be a bit familiar for him is that he did work with Fred Vasseur closely in the past, so that'll certainly help him to understand the processes and understand the team, because he will have Fred to lean on. I think most people agree that Leclerc is likely to have the qualifying advantage unless Hamilton really does regain his past form, particularly like 2020, 2021, where I feel like he was really at his best. But Hamilton might end up having the race advantage since he still has shown to have incredible race speed and strategy even in the past year or so. But, that isn't necessarily guaranteed that Hamilton will have a race advantage, because Leclerc has made some serious inroads into his tire management and race management, and I think he's really the full package now. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out as well. There's so many questions that are going to be answered, so many just very interesting things, to see what's going to happen throughout the year. How is Hamilton going to fit into the Ferrari culture? It's a very different culture from the German and British brands that he's previously been working with. And will his style of things work in that Ferrari culture? He's very outward and is not afraid to speak what he feels. And is that going to work in Ferrari, which has typically been Ferrari? The team matters above all else. So that's going to be wildly interesting. Also, Leclerc's been the golden boy, but Hamilton is a 7-time champion, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out for the team. If the two are closely matched, who is going to get any type of favorism and who, is going to come out on top overall. Also, can Ferrari even be competitive enough for the teammate battle to even matter? If they are the 4th fastest team, then we're going to care a lot less about that driver pairing. So it's really important for Ferrari to build a good car so we can really see that battle play out. So overall, being a Lewis Hamilton fan, I think that's what I am most interested in for the season. I really hope he can regain some of his past form, and I am so incredibly excited to see how that whole battle plays out. And it's going to be really weird seeing him in Ferrari red. And I just won't even believe it when we see that number 44 on the car and him in red overalls. It's going to be really interesting to see. Another big talking point of the year that's going to be very interesting is the amount of rookies that we have this year, some of which are kind of half rookies because they've had some short stints in Formula One, such as Lawson. But really, overall, it seems like there is a changing of the guard in Formula One that's really coming to us. There are 6 rookies. Like I said, some like Lawson have had a few races, but it's almost unprecedented. I don't know if I can think of a time in my time that I've been watching where we've had this many rookies. I mean, we have Lawson, we've got Bortoleto, we've got Antonelli, Hajar doing? I mean, it's very interesting, and Colapinto might be taking over doing seats. You never know what's going to happen there. But yeah, of course, Behrman as well. And yeah, it's going to be wildly interesting to see. I think, in the past, maybe I've and the community has had a bit less faith in some of the rookie drivers, but people like Behrman and Colapinto have really shown that rookies don't have to be discounted off the bat. They can make an impact right away. They still certainly will show some rawness, like we've seen from the Lawsons and the Colapintos and Antonellis, crashing in Italy, crashing in Brazil, all these things. But young drivers are just so much better prepared physically, mentally, and technically than ever before that they can really step in and have an impact right away. Testing is more restricted now than it had been in the past, but teams can still use old cars to give rookies more mileage. That's been particularly apparent for Antonelli, who is said to have had a pretty intensive program with older machinery. So that will really help, especially at the end of a rule cycle. They're not like testing old machinery from a different rule cycle. It'll be very beneficial for them. After watching Formula One for as long as I have, for over a decade now, it's crazy. It's so exciting and weird to see so many new drivers. The grid is really changing. I mean, the Vettels, the Alonsos, Hamiltons, Raikkonens, they're either gone or will be gone soon. And there's a proper changing of the guard. I've really grown familiar with some of the personalities of the drivers over the past decade, and now we'll move on to new drivers and we'll start to appreciate them in time as well. Even like Piastri, I think when he first came in, I think he probably wanted to be a little quiet after his explosive entry into Formula One, but now we're starting to see him come out of his shell a bit more, and I think he's a really well-liked character in the Formula One community. So it'll be interesting to see all these new drivers over the years. Really, overall, the future just looks extremely promising with these new drivers, and it's going to be interesting to see down the line who ends up living up to the hype, who ends up winning races, who ends up winning world championships, or who maybe doesn't make it in F1 and doesn't have the career that they would have hoped, or maybe that people would have thought that they had. The next thing that I'm wildly interested to see what happens, and something that we'll see play out pretty early on, I think, in the season, Red Bull's driver situation and if it will improve or not. This year is either going to be a course correction for Red Bull's driver situation, or it's going to completely derail the train even more than it has been. If Lawson ends up performing better than Perez, then that's good. Then they're, have their problem solved for the meantime. That'll allow a Red Bull Junior, that'll mean that a Red Bull Junior got promoted and gets the partner Verstappen for a while Red Bull builds up the next Verstappen, who looks like it might be Arvin Lindblad. But other than that, they don't really have a mega star on their hands. On the contrary, if Lawson ends up performing poorly, then they are right back in the same spot, and they really don't have anybody convincing to take over for him. They don't believe in Yuki Tsunoda, otherwise they would have promoted him already. And I don't think they have too much faith in Hajar either. And I'm not so sure he's a superstar of the future anyway, so I don't particularly blame them. I feel like, if Lawson doesn't perform well this year, they're going to have to look outside of their driver pool, because if they need a short-term replacement in 2025 or 2026, they really don't have anybody lined up, and I don't know what they'll end up doing. It's going to get particularly tricky for Red Bull if they are not competitive and Verstappen ends up leaving at the end of this year or the next year. Then everything really goes into shambles. They barely have a solution for a second driver to Verstappen, let alone trying to replace him. Any solution for him seems to be, years off. So that'll be a big problem for them if Verstappen does end up leaving. Could see like a George Russell going there or something like that if he ends up getting pushed out of Mercedes from Antonelli. But, that's a lot of what ifs there. Red Bull are just incredibly lucky they have Verstappen, because if they didn't, then they would be in quite the pickle of a driver problem, more so than they already have, and they really wouldn't have had the same success these past few years that they have without Verstappen. So they really need to get on top of things. You think that they would be, completely set up in their driver pool, having two teams, but somehow they continue to fumble the bag with that, and yeah, they are not really prepared or set up for the future. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out in this year and going forward. Continuing on with the Red Bull theme, another question I have of the year is if tensions are going to continue between Red Bull and the Verstappen camp and the rest of the team. There is still a lot of unresolved tension at that team. There's been a big power struggle at Red Bull after the death of Dietrich Mateschitz. And of course, there was the Christian Horner allegations. There was Jos Verstappen's beef with Christian Horner. and just this general looming idea that Verstappen could leave F1 or just go to another team. A lot had happened for Red Bull during the year, and it is still pretty unresolved. It was really boiling away at the front of things for throughout much of the year, particularly at the front and middle. It was really front and center for Red Bull, and that's all the questions that they were getting. But it did die down from conversation online and in the paddock without much real closure to anything. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out this year. I think a big factor of things boiling up or not is the competitiveness of the car. I think the minute the Red Bull is on the back foot and or the Verstappen camp isn't feeling like Red Bull is doing enough or not being competitive enough, then I think we're going to start seeing some more tension boil up again. And I think we're going to see Jos Verstappen putting the pressure on the team. And I don't think Max Verstappen will shy away either. Verstappen is a very good negotiating chip because he truly is the pillar of that team. And if he is unhappy or, steps away, then Red Bull will definitely be worse off. There is so much unfinished business in that team, and I think we're going to see more of that tension this year. It's just a matter of how and when it boils up and how we see it come to the front. The last thing that I am extremely excited to see how it plays out throughout the year is the Carlos Sainz versus Alex Albon battle throughout the year. I think it's been talked about a bit less this year, but I think it's going to be a really interesting thing to look out for. Albon has, of course, really reinvented himself since coming to Williams and has been looking like he could step back into a big team again and thrive. However, I think the arrival of Colapinto made a lot of people question Albon a bit again, myself included in that camp. It's one thing to absolutely trounce Latifi and Sargent, but when the competition gets more tough, will Albon be as good as he's been showing? He definitely didn't have as good of a second half of the year last year as he did maybe in the beginning and of the previous year. Colapinto was much closer than anybody anticipated, and I think that got to Albon a bit, and he didn't look quite as bulletproof throughout the year. But as good as Colapinto seems to be, he is certainly not Carlos Sainz, and Carlos Sainz is going to be a much bigger challenge for Alex Albon. Carlos Sainz is a proven race winner, and he is definitely an above average F1 driver. His technical feedback, race pace, and just really cerebral driving will make him a massive challenge for Albon, a challenge that I don't think Albon will be able to beat. I don't think he'll be too far away or destroyed, but I think Sainz will show Albon what a really great Grand Prix driver is. And I think it's going to be a battle that'll be interesting to see throughout the year, and a little under the radar one that I think everybody should keep a lookout for. All right, so those are some of the bigger talking points going into the 2025 season, and some things that I am extremely interested to see how things play out. It feels so good to be back. I am ready for this 2025 season to get underway. I am ready to have the best year ever of content creation and just making all this happen. I'm excited, I'm energized, and ready to kick things off. Be on the lookout for my way too early predictions coming next, and I appreciate all of your guys' support over the recent videos, and I appreciate your patience while I had a bit of a hiatus. But if you are interested, give the video a like and a subscribe. Let me know down below what you're most excited for in 2025. Other than that, thank you all for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.